All right, we are finishing up the questions on our study on Balak and Balaam, and then we'll be moving on to John the Immerser. As I sent the email out, the notes are on the back table here for John the Immerser, and they're also sent to everybody's emails as well. So, and then I also have, I'm glad I just remembered it, the books for the Sunday class are actually in the back of the car, and I forgot to bring them in. So I will get those and put those on the back table, hopefully in between our class and short service at the end here, so that everybody can get them on the way out if you want one. All right. So, what way or why was Balaam punished, and in what ways were Midian, Moab, and Ammon punished? So, as we've talked about with Balak, the king of Moab hired Balaam to curse the children of Israel. 3 times he was supposed to curse the children of Israel, and yet 3 times he blessed Israel instead. Balaam says, it's not my choice. I literally cannot curse the people. God would not allow him to do so. And yet, Balaam was punished, as we see in Numbers chapter 25. Numbers chapter 25, but going into chapter 26 as well, how that the children of Israel, after they have a situation take place in Numbers chapter 25, going into chapter 26, they then come up against the Midianites, and they also find Balaam among the Midianites, and they kill him for something. So why was Balaam punished?
Wasn't he given a list of circumstances that had to fall into place before he could go, and he didn't win?
Well, so there's that. Yeah, we see that at the very beginning in Numbers chapter 22. God's anger was aroused against Balaam because he went, instead of waiting the 3rd time for these men to come back to him, he instead went. But what he heard God say, at least, if you're going to give him the benefit of the doubt here, was, you can go ahead and go. That's what Balaam heard. But God's anger was aroused, and there's a whole situation with the talking donkey that came up with that. I don't believe that specifically necessarily is why Balaam was ultimately killed later on. What else did Balaam do that ultimately had a direct impact on Israel? Yeah, he taught Balak how to teach the children of Israel to offer things sacrificed to idols, to engage in sexual immorality as it related to idolatry and idol worship. And so somewhere at the end of Numbers chapter 24, after the 4th, it wasn't a 4th, it was, so there were 3 times he blessed the people, and then this last dialogue that he had for Balak was basically a prophecy of here's what's going to happen. And we talked about that in our last class. But then, at the end of chapter 24, Balaam goes his way, Balak goes his way. But apparently, according to the New Testament, what we find is that there are several references to Balaam and how that he loved. First of all, what do we know in terms of his character regarding money? What does the New Testament call him? He was greedy. Okay, he was greedy. And he wanted to get paid. All right. Well, remember that Balak told him in chapter 24, well, the Lord has kept you from this getting paid, this honor that I promised you, because you wouldn't curse the people. You blessed them instead. The Lord kept you from it. Well, Balaam wanted to figure out a loophole. And so somewhere at the end of chapter 24, somewhere in there, before he left Balak, or maybe it was after and he kind of thought on the way, hey, I figured out a way I can do this. But somewhere in there, he spoke to Balak about getting God to curse his own people. And the way that you do that is you teach the children of Israel to worship your gods. Have them worship your gods. Have them eat things sacrificed to idols. Have them be involved in the worship of these gods, which included sexual immorality. And Jehovah, Yahweh, he will curse his own people. And so from a human perspective, a pretty clever way of trying to find a loophole for Balaam, because presumably he did get paid. But what we find, again, in chapter 26 is the fact that he was with the Midianites. I don't know why he was there. Maybe he was kind of just there for a little while before heading back up to Pethor, because that's where his home was. But the children of Israel found I found Balaam as they were going up against the Midianites, and they destroyed the Midianites. They killed Balaam. And there are several references to the fact that the reason why this happened was because Balaam taught Balak to lure the children of Israel away. Now, did that take any responsibility away from Israel for their own sin? Could they all blame, well, it was Balaam's fault or it was Balak's fault? Did God punish Israel in any way? Yeah, he did. And that's what chapter 25 is about. And that's the answer to the next question was, how was Israel punished? We know that there was a plague, okay, that was involved. We know that all those who participated in the worship of these idols and involved in this sexual immorality, they were all executed. But there was a plague besides that. And what's described in chapter 25 almost sounds like someone told on an Israelite who was having a relationship currently right then and there with a woman from Midian. And they were Moses and Aaron and them, or Moses and what was the name of the priest who struck them through? Who was it? Why does it always do this? Come on. Yeah, so this is chapter 26, chapter 25. And so we see Phinehas, verse 7. So Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, I'm sorry if one of you said I didn't hear it. But Phinehas was the one who took a spear or a lance and went into the tent and struck them both through with a single strike. So you kind of get the gist of what was happening from the record. And then after that, the plague stopped. But something like, 25,000 people, 24,000, verse 9, people died in a plague that was taking place. So in addition to, we're not told how many people were killed who were involved in this idolatry, but they were executed. That's the very first thing God says. But then also there was a plague in which 24,000 people died as well because of the sin in Israel. So yes, Israel was held accountable for their actions and for their sin. But so Midian and certainly Moab and Ammon. Remember, God specifically told the children of Israel through Moses and through Joshua, they were not allowed to attack Moab and Ammon because both of those nations were of the lineage of whom? Lot. And so because of Lot, for Lot's sake, God had given them those lands. You do not go up and fight against them. God did not want them fighting. But Midian was fair game. Okay. However, Moab and Ammon were punished. Do you remember what we're told? And we studied it. We looked at it in our study going forward. What did God say as a result of Moab and Ammon and what they did and what they were involved in trying to hire Balaam to curse you? What punishment, I guess you could say it was a punishment, was laid out for Moab and Ammon? They were not allowed at any time into the number of Israel. And this was said several times in Deuteronomy as well as going forward in Joshua because of them hiring. And that's part of how we know Ammon was involved. In the account, we know Midian and Moab were involved. But God says that it was Moab and Ammon who were involved. Ammon was involved as well. And so because of that, no one's going to be a stranger from Moab, a stranger from Ammon. They will not be allowed into the number of the people. And so because of that is a punishment directly resulting from their actions or their involvement in the situation. Now, Moab and Ammon eventually did there have to become a situation because they were thorns in the side of Israel quite a bit. Yes, eventually there was some situation with Moab and Ammon where there were battles fought. So I'm not saying Moab and Ammon never ever ended up having to fight or battle with Israel or anything like that. But at this point, the penalty was they weren't allowed to become or to take part in the people of Israel.
So you mean like they couldn't be counted with, I guess I'm not sure what you mean. I know Ruth was a Moab.
Right. So, yeah.
Of the time frame,
Yeah, so this would have been before Jericho because they hadn't moved up to Jericho yet. But in 23 and in verse 3, and then again in Nehemiah, but 23 starting in verse, where am I? Deuteronomy. 23 verse 3. All right, so God speaks to the children of Israel. He says, "An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you." Now remember the people of Jethro's people, they did meet the children of Israel on the road. What were their names? Was that the Midianites that they met? And that is acknowledged that Jethro's people did at that time meet them coming out of Egypt, gave them bread and water. Moab and Ammon did not. But here in verse 4, and this is part of that discussion as well, talking about the assembly. They shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, it may be that it's specifically to a male, and that could explain Rahab. Because even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. So it might be that applied to males, the males specifically, and not every single one. So that might, or maybe because of Rahab's faith, maybe that was an exception in that situation. But I would go with probably the males is being referenced. Yeah. So, but that and then it comes up again in Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. The same situation comes up where Nehemiah is reminding the children of Israel, this is what God said. And because of this, because they hired Balaam against you, and because of these two passages, that's how we know Ammon was involved. It's not mentioned in the account, but we're told after the fact that Ammon was involved. Any thoughts through question 2, question 3? We'll get back to question 1 in just a minute. All right, and we've already answered this one. What gender was Balaam's donkey? Female. And why is this interesting? Yeah. The angels are always referenced as, even though angels don't have necessarily gender because they're spiritual beings, there's no gender when it comes to spiritual beings, but angels are always referenced as he. Okay, always. Never once is an angel ever represented as she. But in this particular situation, the donkey, she spoke. Okay? And so that suggests, at least for this moment, that God enabled this donkey to have the intelligence and the ability to be able to talk. And again, we talked about Balaam and his mental state, and again, there's a lot of things that we don't have specifics of in the account. It may very well be that Balaam was shocked, but at least the way it reads in the account, it's almost as if this happens all the time for him. But he had this casual conversation, and maybe it just never clicked in that moment. It was just, he was so angry and so mad, all of a sudden he starts talking to this donkey, and the donkey's talking back. But regardless, we do know it was a she, and the Hebrew specific there that it was she. And I just think that's a very interesting detail that we're told that, and that suggests that this isn't God speaking through the donkey. It's not an angel speaking through the donkey. It's the donkey speaking. Anything through that? All right. Tied to that, going back to question 1, what number comes up throughout this account? Throughout the account, what number keeps coming up? 3. Yeah. How many times? Where all through the account do we see the number 3 cropping up? How many times was Balaam supposed to wait? 3 times that these men were to come. They came twice. Balaam goes to the Lord both times. The Lord tells Balaam the second time, if they come to you again, then you can go with them. And of course, Balaam doesn't wait. He goes the second time and God's angry. And then how many times does the angel of the Lord stand in the way of the donkey? 3 times. Okay, and of course, in all 3 times, the donkey even mentions the fact that Balaam struck her, and she says, why have you struck me these 3 times? In fact, eventually God opens the eyes of Balaam, he sees the angel, and God tells Balaam, I would have killed you if it hadn't been for that donkey. She led you out of the way. She saved your life. So how many nations were involved in this effort to curse the children of Israel? 3. Midianites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites. How many times did Balaam, was he supposed to curse Israel but bless them instead? 3. Yeah, 3. So this number keeps coming up throughout the account. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily any magical component to that. I'm just saying that throughout the Bible, there are times and situations, accounts, where there's a common thread through there. And it kind of speaks to the providence of God and the reason why that's recorded specifically for us to know that. And it kind of speaks to that power that God has. Not that it didn't actually happen, and they're incorporating some, neat little messages or fancy little codes or something like that. A lot of people read the Bible, oh, it's all full of code. None of this stuff really happened. It's the numbers and the codes. That's not what we're talking about. But God does use numbers to express certain things sometimes. 7 commonly represents what? Completeness, the fullness of time. There are multiples of 7. How many Sabbaths were they supposed to wait from Passover to Pentecost? 7 times 7. 7 Sabbaths. Okay, so there often are multiples. 40 days, 40 nights comes up quite a bit. But the number 3 also comes up quite a bit. And 3 comes up a lot in this account as well. Last question. What lessons can we learn from Balak and Balaam? First of all, let's ask the question, are there any good qualities from Balak or Balaam that we can take away from this situation in this account? Again, a lot of commentaries reference and assume and say that Balaam was a prophet of Jehovah, and he's only referenced as a prophet once, and that's in context of him being not very good, not a very good person, but the fact that the donkey calmed the madness of the prophet, Peter says, but that's not the only time in the New Testament scriptures where the term prophet is used outside of the prophets of God. It could be reference to false prophets as well, okay, or false God prophets as well. So that doesn't mean he was a prophet of Jehovah. And everything we've seen from his character suggests he was basically a prophet for hire. And he was greedy. Okay, now it's possible, even though the text doesn't say this, it's possible that he was of some kind of connection to the patriarchal law, priesthood, or in some way associated with the prophets of the patriarchal law. We know Melchizedek, that's the only one we know for sure, was a priest under the patriarchal law. Give some of these commentaries a benefit of the doubt. Let's say for a moment he was truly a prophet of Jehovah. Okay, was he a good one? I mean, it's not like he chose to bless the children of Israel on his own. He came out and said, I do not have a choice here. God will not let me. It's not like he chose to side with Jehovah. And a lot of times commentaries they'll kind of try to bring that out, that this was him being faithful to Jehovah. No, I don't believe it was. I think if he'd had the opportunity to curse them, he would have. But God literally wouldn't let him. And so I don't think there was anything, at least in the account that we have, that suggests that he was a true righteous, or even at one time righteous prophet of God. Everything speaks to negative characteristics. All right. Now, of those characteristics, what can we learn not to do? I mean, some of the adjectives used in the New Testament, he was greedy, right? There's reference in Revelation about the doctrine of Balaam and the idea of basically teaching others to fall away. Okay, it's carried through with that, and mentioned the doctrine of Balaam's and the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. And the doctrine of Balaam taught the children of Israel to turn away from Jehovah. What's one, if there's nothing else we take from the example, the bad example of Balaam, what's one that we definitely need to walk away with? What did he attempt to do, even though God wouldn't let him curse the people? He tried to find a loophole. Okay, he tried to find a loophole. I can't curse them, but I can help you anyway. You can still pay me. I can still get paid for this. I can tell you what's going to cause the downfall of Israel. So he sought, even though God prevented him from achieving that honor, that being paid, he still tried to find a way around what Jehovah wanted. Now, is that applicable for us today? Do people do that today with God's word, trying to find loopholes? Trying to find a way around, well, yeah, God says this, but only in this context. I actually had a quote, apostolic priest tell me one time that Romans 1, in the condemnation of homosexuality, that Paul talks about the Gentiles and they're giving themselves over to strange flesh and so forth. I had a quote, apostolic priest say that was only in context of idolatry, that God never condemned homosexuality in general, only in the context of idolatry. That was his explanation for that. I asked him to explain 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and he kind of waffled around a little bit on that one. But his thought was, no, it's only applicable in that scenario. I asked him about Sodom and Gomorrah, and his statement was, we have to assume they were given a commandment by God that they didn't obey. It had nothing to do with their homosexuality. It had to do with the fact that God told them to do something and they didn't do it. Well, no, we don't have to assume it. When we talk about necessary inference, you're inferring that and you're assuming that. But that's not a necessary inference or necessary assumption to make. In fact, we're told that they were evil. And in fact, that whole discussion between Abraham and God was all about how many were what? Faithful or righteous. And God knew full well there weren't as many, Abraham knew too. That's why he kept going down. But I think Abraham settled at that bottom number thinking, well, there has to be at least that many. Abraham or Lot and his, of course you have to wonder if God even considered his daughters to be righteous or not, given what they did later, or his wife for that matter. In fact, the only one in that family who's ever referred to as righteous is Lot. Okay, Peter refers to righteous Lot. So there may not even have been just his family. He may have even been less than that. But regardless, trying to find loopholes, trying to redefine terms, that's the way of justification, just justifying ourselves in maybe something we want to do or something we have done. And certainly as Christians, we have to be very careful not to seek to find a loophole to enable us to be able to do something we want to do, but we know God's word doesn't allow us to do that or says we shouldn't do that. Anything else? All right, let's move over to John the Immerser. So John, and I'm calling him the Immerser because remember the term baptism literally means immersion. It was transliterated from Greek into English. Well, the term Baptist, John the Baptist, as he's labeled in the New Testament, is exactly the same way. It's simply a kind of a noun version, I guess you could say, of baptizo. It's a different term, but it's the same root, baptizo, but it's just transliterated into English, Baptist. And I've thought to myself, how much different or how better would it be for certain individuals, especially who may go by the name of Baptist and so forth, to, instead of reading John the Baptist, they read John the Immerser instead, because that's what baptism is. It's immersion. But in Luke chapter 1, this is the kind of the beginning of our understanding of John the Baptist. And we're actually given, interestingly, the background both of, in fact, I guess you could say we actually have more background on Zacharias and Elizabeth than we do on Joseph and Mary. Okay, we do know some things about Joseph and Mary, but I would suggest we actually know maybe a little bit more, especially about Zacharias, because we know what tribe they're from. We know, of course, we know the genealogies of Mary and Joseph, so there is that. But in terms of what they were doing before, what their character, we have a little bit more insight, maybe than we do, particularly for Joseph. Maybe not. We'd have a little bit more for Mary. So, Luke chapter 1, starting in verse. So this is who is Luke being written to? It's the account of Luke, but who's he writing to? What else did he write to Theophilus? Acts, yeah, the book of Acts. And in fact, this was basically a two-part letter because Luke refers in Acts to his previous letter of the Gospel of Luke. So basically, he's giving him, here's the rest of the story, up to the time that I left off from the end of Luke. So here, starting in verse 5, there was in the days of Herod the king of Judea a certain priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of some of the specifics here. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So automatically, what do we know about his parents? They were of the tribe of Levi, which means they were what? Part of what? Priesthood. Yeah, and of course, the men were the ones who served in the temple and so forth, but the women had their roles as well with regard to the tribe of Levi. So we know automatically that John the Baptist is of what tribe? Levi, which I do think is interesting. And that is actually going to be an important point when we start talking about some of the external biblical references to John the Baptist. Just remember the fact that he is of the tribe of Levi. That's actually going to be a really big point regarding a certain faith system, or however you want to say it, certain church that operates today. The fact that he is of the tribe of Levi. So starting in verse 6, they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. Does this mean that they never sinned? Is that what that means? That they were perfect? Paul, he said, when he was speaking to the Sanhedrin, he says, I've lived in all good conscience before God to this day. Does that mean Paul was perfect? No, but according to the direction of the law, when you sinned, there were sacrifices that needed to be made. And what this means is that they fulfilled those requirements of the law. So that when they did sin, and if that sin demanded a sacrifice, they offered that sacrifice. Okay, so it's not that they were sinless ever, but they were blameless with regard to their responsibility to fulfilling the law. That's what that means. And they were both righteous. Okay, they both sought to know and understand God's standard of right and wrong in the law. They knew what God's standard was, and they applied it in their life. Verse 7, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well advanced in years. Now, we're not told exactly how old they are, but the text suggests, in fact, we'll find here in just a minute, Zacharias' response here, but it suggests that they were beyond childbearing age. Now, automatically, what other situation seems to mirror what's happening? Abraham and Sarah. Yeah, Abraham and Sarah. The birth of Isaac. Okay, they were both well beyond, and in that case, they were, 120 years old, I think Abraham was. So they were well beyond childbearing age. And both Abraham and Sarah, both were somewhat, I wouldn't say that they didn't believe God, but their immediate reaction was such that they said, there's no way that can happen. I'm too old, to have a child and so forth. Both Abraham and Sarah did that, and we looked at that when we talked about Abraham and Sarah. But here in verse 8, so we know Elizabeth, not only was Elizabeth beyond age, but she was also barren. Okay, we know she was barren as well. So in verse 8, so it was that while he was serving as priest before God in the order of his division, according to the custom of the priesthood, his lot fell to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. And the whole multitude of the people was praying outside at the hour of incense. And then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. So it's first of all, it's interesting that this is happening at this point. Okay, he's before the altar of the Lord. He's burning incense to the Lord. So he's in the act of a righteous fulfillment of the law. He's burning incense. Everybody's outside praying. And an angel of the Lord appears to him standing at the right side of the altar. And I just think that's interesting. What does the idea of the right hand or the right side convey, especially in the Old Testament? Authority, okay? Power and authority. If somebody's at somebody's right hand, they are speaking for Jehovah. Okay, and so whether or not that's and I think it is part of the why he's appearing at the right hand. But that specificity, I think, is also important. Verse 12, when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. Yeah, I think it would fall upon me too. Verse 13, but the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zacharias, for your prayer is heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. So what do we know, at least at this point, that Zacharias, at least at some point, prayed about? Having a child. Okay, having a child, and whether he was specifically praying for a son, and of course, in that day and age, if you got the opportunity to choose, which obviously you can't, but if you had the opportunity to choose, what would be the most important to a Jewish family? Having a son. Okay, the genealogy went through the male. And so having a son would have been of primary and passing along. In fact, that was part of what Zacharias' these priests, they would train their sons of the tribe of Levi. They would teach them to take their place one day when they got too old to do it. And they would pass along that same thing that the Lord commanded of what would be done in the temple. Zacharias, at least at some point, whether or not at this point he was still praying for this, I don't know, because of his reaction, the fact that Elizabeth, first of all, she's beyond age at this point. So whether he was still praying for this or not, at the very least, at some point he had been praying. And to me, it makes the point even more, I guess you could say, beautiful, if this is something he had been praying about maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, let's say they're in their 70s, just for the sake of argument here. Maybe this was something he was praying 30 years ago when she was getting, to a point where a few more years she won't be able to bear a child, and maybe he was fervently praying for a child, and then maybe she got beyond the age to bear a child, and maybe, okay, so it's not in God's will for us to have a child. To me, if that were the case, the fact that your prayer has been heard, God didn't forget, okay, again, assuming that this was in the past that he prayed this, God never forgets what you pray for. It doesn't necessarily mean God is going to respond immediately. And like I said, the potential here, the possibility that this may have been years or decades down the road that this is being referenced. Because again, in just kind of jumping ahead for a second, verse 18, he says, I am an old man, my wife is well advanced in years. And in fact, he's going to be, I say punished, there's going to be a consequence for his lack of belief. What's it going to be? You remember? Yeah, he's not going to be allowed to speak. Okay, he's going to be mute or dumb, as the term dumb means mute, because of his disbelief. So it suggests to me that this wasn't necessarily a recent prayer. It's not like he prayed for this last night, and all of a sudden this is why the angel appears, why God said, okay, I'll give you a son because you prayed for it all of a sudden. I tend to think that this was something maybe he prayed for a while back. But now it's past. God's will be done. But God says, I heard your prayer. Okay? And there was a plan involved. I just think that just kind of enhances the thought for us, for you and me, when we pray and we ask God for assistance and we ask God for help, that we don't think in terms of long-term how that may come about. We think of immediate today, tomorrow, this week, this month, this year maybe, but we may not think in terms of decades down the road. And it just shows the power of God. Again, if that's the case, and I'm not saying absolute for certain because the text doesn't say that, but I just think that certainly would be, I think the principle certainly is true, that God certainly can answer your prayers, even if he doesn't do it immediately. He may very well do it down the road, and in this case, especially in a way you don't expect. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. So in verse 13, he says, you will call his name John. Now, it's interesting because there are several occasions, both in the Old and New Testaments, where a miraculous birth takes place and the parents are told to name that child a certain thing. And I just think that that's an interesting fact that Jesus isn't the only, of course, he is the only born of a virgin. That is different. Okay, but certainly we have Ishmael when he was beyond the age. It certainly was miraculous for nature's sake. Okay, Jesus is a whole different nature's situation that was against nature. But you have Abraham and Sarah and their situation. You've got Samson's parents. As we studied Samson, we learned that Samson's birth was miraculous. Okay, and there were several occasions where they were told to name the child this. Okay, this is what you're going to name this child. Just as Jesus was named Jesus, they were told his name shall be John. And that's actually going to be an important point going forward. Verse 14, you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. He will also be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. Whether or not, there's some commentaries that suggest he actually had the Holy Spirit while he was inside of Elizabeth. That may be, the reason they do that is because they link John's reaction while he's in the womb to Mary when he hears her voice here in a little while at the end of chapter 1, and that a natural situation, a baby shouldn't know who that is. And so that is possible. It's also possible that in that instance, God simply allowed John, as a forming baby, to understand that this is Mary, the mother of Jesus, in that moment. But it is possible from the womb, that some go back and forth. Does that mean from the moment he was born, or even while he was still in utero, in the womb? And I think there is a case to be made that in some form or fashion, there was a miraculous reaction, or a reaction that would seem to indicate the presence of the Holy Spirit when he came into contact with Mary later. But we see certain aspects of his character, certain things that he's not going to do. He's not going to drink neither wine nor strong drink. He's going to be great in the sight of the Lord. Great in the sight of the Lord, there's no definition there in terms of what does that mean. But certainly we know what that means. But the angel doesn't appear to go into detail as to what he's going to accomplish specifically. But the only real specific thing he says is, he shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. First of all, what's the big deal with that? First of all, why did the angel specify the difference between wine and strong drink? What was the difference? Yeah, so strong drink was designed specifically to get one drunk. That's what it was designed to do. That's what they called strong drink. It doesn't even really compare to what we have today available, where there are additives and stuff added to make it even stronger. But strong drink in that time was designed to get one drunk. This is part of the reason why Solomon in Proverbs warns over and over again about wine and strong drink. But then wine here that is referenced, this term was the everyday drink that they had, where there was a certain part of wine or grape juice. It wasn't alcoholic, okay, but in the absence of refrigeration, if you let it go too long, it would start to ferment. But they had part wine or part grape juice and part water. And some of the commentaries have linked the two as being because of the sources of water were so contaminated, they used the wine to purify the water. That's how they could make it suitable to drink, especially in highly populated areas. But that's what they drank all the time. But strong drink was condemned almost universally throughout that society. But I think it's interesting that the angel specifies that. Because of that, and the way he's described later, many attribute John to having taken what type of vow? The Nazarite vow. Not Nazarite, Nazirite. And we'll talk about that a little bit next Wednesday night. But it is notable that that's never actually said. That it's never said that he actually took that vow. But we'll talk more about that next Wednesday. Thank you, everybody.